I decided to make this video to shed some light on actual job market demands for DevOps engineering skill set. So basically, if you ever ask yourself the question, what should I learn if I want to be hired as a DevOps engineer? Or if I want to simply add DevOps skills to my existing engineering skills to make me more valuable? What are those tools that I need to learn? The best way to answer this is not to read some articles and hear people's opinions based on their limited experience. Instead, the most transparent way is simply check job posts to see the requirements across different companies. Because ultimately, you want to be valuable and demanded on job market and know the skills that most companies would hire for. So let me help you with this research. Let's literally Google together and go through some DevOps job posts and break them down for you to see what tech market values and requires you to know in terms of DevOps engineering skills. Now, I have been doing this for years to stay up to date with my skill set, but also to make sure our DevOps Bootcamp and all the trainings are always on point with market demand. Because it doesn't matter how amazingly you know something in engineering if no company or team is looking for it. Because the very reason why DevOps engineers are one of the highest paid roles is because of the market demand. So we can't ignore that, right? And we won't just search in US, but also in Europe, UK, Canada, South America, Asia. So we will see the common patterns across companies, but also across continents, which is great because it means your skills are relevant in every corner of the globe. Isn't that amazing? Not all professionals actually have the luxury status of being equally needed everywhere in the world. And we actually put together those required and optional tools across the countries for DevOps engineering jobs in one document. So go grab it from below the video and let's dive in. So this is the first DevOps engineer job post, which, by the way, is an entry-level remote full-time position, and it pays 140 till 190K per year. So let's start first with their requirements, which is basically what are the things that you need to know to fulfill this role. And not surprisingly, and you will see this pattern in almost every DevOps engineering role, is that knowledge of CI/CD principles and best practices is required of you as a DevOps engineer. And the reason for that is I often say that CI/CD is the backbone of DevOps. There are teams that do not use infrastructure as code. There are teams that use private clouds, so their engineers don't even know AWS or Azure or any other public cloud. They may not even be using any scripting and automation tools. But one thing that you can be sure that they are using is CI/CD pipelines. So this is always at the core of DevOps engineer skill set and also responsibility once you actually work as a DevOps engineer. Another thing on the list we see is experience with cloud platforms, either AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud. And the reason why often you will see all those listed as alternatives is that if you learn one of those public cloud platforms, like AWS, for example, the knowledge you gain here, especially if you learn the concepts, not only service-specific stuff, that knowledge is directly transferable into Azure or Google Cloud or any other public cloud platform. And that's why companies would usually list all of them and not just one of them specifically as a requirement. Then here you also have scripting languages, Bash, Python, or Ruby. Again, one of them is required, not all of them. And the interesting thing is that a lot of DevOps engineers actually have IT operations background, so they come with expertise in Bash scripting from Linux, but they don't necessarily know any programming languages like software engineers do, right? So many IT operations engineers don't know Python or Ruby or other scripting languages. And even though Bash scripting is also scripting, knowing Python or actual programming language for automation scripting is actually a huge advantage and a plus point for a DevOps engineer. And that's why we not only cover Linux and Bash scripting in our DevOps Bootcamp, but we actually have a dedicated module on Python programming basics and then another dedicated module for Python automation for DevOps engineers. And you also see that it is a required skill. Another thing that you will notice across companies, across countries, is that Docker and Kubernetes have basically become a standard pretty much in all the modern systems. So all the engineers work with Docker and Kubernetes, and as a DevOps engineer, that's basically your core, that should be your core expertise, because you're going to be the one that will be teaching others like software engineers and operations engineers, even security engineers, how to use those tools. And that's why you need to have expertise in Docker and Kubernetes. And again, that's why Kubernetes is after CI/CD, I would say Kubernetes is the major piece of technology that we cover in depth in our DevOps Bootcamp and other trainings, basically. You will also see that automation tools for infrastructure provisioning like Terraform or infrastructure configuration like Ansible, Puppet, and so on are often listed either as nice to have or sometimes required skill set. But over time, it is actually becoming more and more required because the systems, the infrastructure is getting more complex. So you need automation to actually handle those complex infrastructure setups with some kind of automation tool. And again, that's why we cover not only one of them, but both Terraform and Ansible, because they have different purposes actually. So you learn when to use Terraform, you learn when to use Ansible. And besides requirements and the preferred qualifications, you also have here the key responsibilities that basically describe not only tool level, but rather on a workflow or concept level, what you will be doing in this role and what your main responsibilities will be. And again, at the top, you will see design, implement, and manage CI/CD pipelines, which is the core of your responsibility, and combining and integrating it with Docker and Kubernetes and all the other tools, including the automation tools. And finally, you see a mention of Git, which is a version control system. And for software developers, this is a pretty self-explanatory thing. However, there are a lot of engineers with different backgrounds other than software development, like, again, IT operations, network engineers, and so on, that don't really have the experience of working with Git workflows in a team. So knowing Git is definitely something that should be kind of default for a DevOps engineer. Like, you need to know how to use Git, how to work with Git workflows, and so on. And in DevOps Bootcamp, and it kind of happened naturally that Git is actually one of the first modules as a prerequisite of the bootcamp, and then for the rest of the modules throughout the entire bootcamp, you are using Git and Git workflows with every single technology in every single module afterwards, because it kind of naturally integrates into DevOps engineers' daily work and responsibilities. So you should be kind of natural in Git as a DevOps engineer. So here we have a junior DevOps engineer job in India. And here in required skills and qualifications, we see the key concepts and tools that they're asking. Basic understanding of cloud platforms, AWS preferred, but others are accepted as well. Exposure to CI/CD, familiarity with Linux-based systems, and shell scripting. So as you see, they're using words like basic or just to be familiar or to have exposure instead of knowledge or expertise of these tools or understanding how version control works, and an interest in learning Kubernetes. And then in some nice to have or preferred qualifications, just knowledge of what infrastructure as code means and some of its tools, as well as familiarity with monitoring and logging. So as you see, the bar to get this type of job is actually pretty low as a junior DevOps engineer. And that's also why we have so many junior to even mid-level DevOps engineers in our DevOps Bootcamp, because they want to learn all these concepts and all these tools to the higher level, to be able to actually implement very complex end-to-end DevOps systems with these tools instead of just having basic understanding or basic familiarity or exposure to these tools. So we're actually training existing working DevOps engineers in those technologies, because sometimes it's actually difficult to learn a lot of these skills just on job because either projects do not allow it or you just don't have safeguarded environment where you can try out and test out and learn all these things. And now if we go to one of the senior DevOps engineering positions, we can see what they expect at a higher level, which is knowledge of Linux, networking, virtualization, proficiency. So now they need a proper knowledge and understanding of these tools, proficiency in Ansible, Kubernetes, monitoring tools like the whole Prometheus stack, Jenkins, shell scripting, and Git. And this is a senior developer position. And if you scroll through these jobs, the concepts and tools they're expecting are pretty much consistently the same. And for seniors, they expect you to know these tools at a level that you can actually deploy them and use them together to build DevOps processes. Whereas as a junior engineer, they're expecting you to learn at work. Now let's go to another country like Brazil, for example. And in the requirements, we can again see Jenkins, CI/CD automation, Terraform with infrastructure as code, AWS services and concepts, AWS IAM, Kubernetes, Docker, monitoring, and let's check another position here again, which is for a less senior position. You're going to have CI/CD systems, Terraform and infrastructure as code, Python, Bash, AWS. And these are the tasks that they would expect you to do at this position, this mid-level kind of position, optimizing CI/CD pipelines, building reusable CI/CD workflows. And you can do that if you know best practices as well as how to actually write extendable CI/CD pipeline code, how to automate a legacy CI infrastructure and migrate it probably to GitHub Actions CI instead. Again, you need to know what are the best practices, what are the targets, how to map that, and how to understand the legacy workflows and how to turn them into modern CI/CD workflows. And for that, you need to understand not just the tools, not just how GitHub Actions works or how Jenkins works or how one single tool works, but how the concepts work as well as the whole ecosystem, like how to work with the architecture of a CI/CD pipeline where the jobs and pipelines will run. So the administration side of things is as important as just writing pipeline code. And it says here runners and VMs, which is part of the architecture of the CI/CD pipeline. Not just how to create a pipeline, but actually how to manage the VMs where the pipeline jobs will get executed. And how to migrate all this to AWS using Terraform, which means, and this is exactly the point I always mention, in DevOps, you take multiple technologies and you combine them together to build DevOps processes. And this is exactly what they're asking you here. So if you don't know how to combine AWS with Terraform, if you don't know how to architect CI/CD pipeline platforms, how to configure the runners on AWS EC2 instances, for example, and how to write all this configuration in Terraform, then you're not going to be able to perform this task. So you need understanding of the concepts and then understanding of the tools and how they integrate with each other, which is exactly the main focus and the biggest topic in our entire DevOps Bootcamp. In every single module, we try to combine as many technologies and concepts of DevOps and cloud as possible, because that's what DevOps is. And that's how you should learn DevOps in practice to build these complex systems. Not just isolated one course here and one technology there, but actually learn by building these entire pipelines and entire end-to-end processes. Let's move to another continent and another country. This time it's England, London. Let's see what they require here. The key skills, again, Amazon and various Amazon services. Proficient in Terraform. So this is a more senior role. Good understanding and experience of firewall concepts, IP tables, and so on. Security groups, database and their security, proficiency in shell and other automation scripts, strong knowledge in security. And this is actually an interesting topic because in senior DevOps engineer roles, security is often highlighted. And in practice, that's often the DevSecOps skill set. And that's why our DevSecOps Bootcamp is actually meant for mid-level or already experienced DevOps engineers who want to get to this next level to learn everything which is security related in the entire ecosystem of DevOps and cloud. So this is cloud security, this is Kubernetes security, container security, and most importantly, the entire CI/CD pipeline security. So securing the CI/CD platform itself, its architecture, how to use various credentials and accesses of CI/CD pipeline to these other systems that it talks to, as well as the actual security automation in the pipeline for the application, code scans, and so on. So security part of DevOps is actually an advanced skill set, which is a whole field on its own. That's why I created an entire bootcamp covering that directly builds on top of the mid-level to senior DevOps engineer skill set that we cover in DevOps Bootcamp. And again, you need to have experience with CI/CD pipelines. Jenkins is highlighted here, which is exactly the tool that we're teaching. Even though it's not the most modern one, it's still one of the most highly demanded and used in lots and lots of companies today. Docker experience with production grade practices, which is also very important, because if you really want to be able to use these tools properly, and especially create these complex DevOps processes where they are chained together, you need to understand the best practices. You need to understand how to deploy them in production. AWS CLI and Bash are listed separately because both of these are actually extremely important combination for automating some of the stuff, because DevOps is all about automation, right? And let's check another probably more senior DevOps engineer job. Here you have the salary range, and let's jump right into the requirements. So you need to have a solid understanding of DevOps practices and processing and supporting tools. So entire DevOps ecosystem with all the tooling, CI/CD tools, Jenkins, and some of the tools that integrate into the CI/CD ecosystem like Nexus, Git, Docker, and so on, Kubernetes and containerization, and some nice to haves, useful, which is security, cloud technologies. So they don't have as high requirements. For example, it doesn't even mention monitoring of Prometheus stack that we cover, or Terraform or Ansible, which are separate tools that allow you to do a lot of stuff on their own. And it doesn't actually have a lot from DevSecOps, except for just networks, protocols, and security. So this is a senior DevOps engineer with a pretty good salary range. And they don't even require not even 70% of what we cover and teach in DevOps and DevSecOps bootcamps. They actually need much less. Let's jump to final country and continent of Canada this time. Let's see what they are searching for. Again, this is a senior role because they need 5+ years of experience. So again, expertise in Linux scripting, Shell, Bash scripting, which is an entire separate module to build those skills in our DevOps Bootcamp. And again, you have the CI/CD knowledge, which is always consistently on the list, Kubernetes, Ansible, Helm, and so on. Again, it doesn't even require AWS, Terraform, Prometheus stack, which is a more complex topic, and it's still a pretty senior level role. And here it lists the responsibilities, what you will actually be doing, hands-on, and obviously designing, implementing, and maintaining CI/CD pipelines for the entire deployment automation, which is definitely a skill that experienced DevOps engineers should know about. Now, this is actually very interesting because if you are proficient in all these concepts and technologies that we cover in only DevOps Bootcamp, not even mentioning DevSecOps, if you understand those tools and more importantly, the underlying concepts, part of that understanding already includes that you can make decisions about which tools are best fit for existing processes, how to optimize things, how to replace tools, what new tools to introduce, what tools to disregard, and how to make these type of decisions based on what you want to achieve in the project. So these are the business or technical goals of the project, and you can map those to, okay, how do we then implement this with DevOps principles? So you need to have understanding, a big picture view of the concepts and tools, which tool is used for what use case, for what technical and business use case, and how you can combine those tools to build the solutions. So you are an architect as a DevOps engineer. You need to have this high level grasp of things and be able to really visualize how you're going to combine things to solve different problems. And again, along with technical skills, this is what's expected of you as a DevOps architect or DevOps engineer. And if you properly learn those stuff, then that will be a natural part of your knowledge as well. And let's actually check one final position. Let's choose Junior DevOps Engineer this time. So this one is Junior DevOps Engineer. And let's see what the requirements are. Python programming, building and managing Docker images and containers. So pretty basic. Work with technical teams to deliver software in CI/CD culture. Not 100% sure what that means. For me, it sounds like you're not responsible for completely building and managing the CI/CD pipelines, but you're going to be part of it. Help maintain DevOps engineering priorities and backlog. Again, you're not in charge of identifying important DevOps tasks, but just to be there to help. And since it's a junior position, you're not expected to know a lot of the DevOps tools. So that's why they're expecting you to quickly learn at work. Then we have some other technical skills like Kubernetes with EKS or other managed Kubernetes services, experience with Google Cloud Platform, familiarity with GitHub Actions or some similar CI/CD tools. Again, they don't expect a deep expertise, but just understanding the CI/CD concepts and knowing basics. Exposure to Terraform. Again, they don't expect you to know Terraform. On a high level, programming and scripting, Python, Bash, Prometheus stack, Elastic Stack, Kubernetes operators, Helm charts, database, and so on. And some networking, security, basics, like basic AWS services and so on. And again, these are actually pretty low entry level for DevOps engineers because what they require here, so the tools, but also the level of knowledge of these tools is maybe like 20 to 30% of what we cover in DevOps Bootcamp. And that's why we have a lot of junior DevOps engineers who use our bootcamp to learn faster for their existing jobs. Now, I want to highlight that in senior DevOps engineer jobs, of course, you have 5+ or 7+ years of experience, right? And we have a lot of beginners in DevOps engineering who join our DevOps bootcamp and they learn the DevOps skills to the mid-level or senior DevOps engineer level through our bootcamp. But in practice, because they don't have any work experience, they cannot apply directly to senior DevOps engineer roles, which is logical. But here is where it gets interesting, because if you know all these tools, if you have a project portfolio that you are building throughout the DevOps bootcamp, and if you send them along in your job application for a junior DevOps position, for example, because you've never had a DevOps engineer work experience, so this is your entry point. First of all, compared to other candidates for the same role, you're gonna stand out like 100 times because of your project portfolio and because the level of your knowledge. Because nobody's gonna expect the level of knowledge that you're getting from the DevOps Bootcamp from a junior engineer. And we get this feedback all the time from our students because they have surprisingly more advanced skills for the position they're applying for. So that's gonna be your entry point. And you're gonna have a huge advantage compared to other candidates. But once you actually get the job and you show and demonstrate at work what you're able to do beyond what is required from a junior DevOps engineer, which is basically just really 20 to 25% maybe of what we teach, your already advanced skills will make it much easier and faster for you to move to mid-level and senior level position within the same company. Because you have already learned all of this and you don't need to learn at work, which is what they expect from you. So that jump, that career jump and level up is going to be much faster and easier for you. And that's why I wanted to demonstrate these junior versus senior or mid-level DevOps engineer requirements across companies, across countries and continents to show you where you stand and what tools and what skills you need to learn to get to the senior level, which may look and sound daunting for you, but if you have the right roadmap and right guide, it's very easy to do in a very short amount of time. And you can also see the drastic difference between the salaries of junior DevOps engineers and mid-level or senior DevOps engineers. You make the jump actually very fast in your salary by knowing those tools properly, which makes sense, but it's still something that a lot of people cannot easily achieve. And that's why if you have an easier and clear path to jump from junior level to senior level in a short amount of time, then that's going to be the best investment because of the salary difference between those two levels. We can see that consistently in every country, especially in countries like in India, especially when through the seniority level, you actually get access to the remote jobs that pay even better than the local ones. Now, as you see, these job descriptions are specific on tools, but it's really hard to know the level of expertise needed for each tool. Plus, when you read design, implement, and manage CI/CD pipelines to streamline development and deployment processes with best practices, it's really hard to know what that actually means if you haven't learned it. So you probably feel like, I know Jenkins or GitLab CI, but I don't know what their application looks like, what their deployment environment looks like. I don't know if I know enough to take on the tasks and responsibilities for that project. Or infrastructure as code with Terraform. You may think, I know Terraform to some level, but I don't know what kind of infrastructure they have. Will I be able to join in the team and understand what they're doing with their current Terraform configuration? And the only way to gain that confidence and that feeling of, I know these tools and concepts so well that I can use them flexibly in any environment, any project, no matter what their tech stack looks like. And you know when this is true? When you know the concepts and not just the tools. That's when you have that level of confidence. Like if I know what an ideal automated streamlined CI/CD pipeline looks like with an ideal Git workflow, then when I join the team, I can look at their pipeline and I can go, oh, you guys are installing some tools like NPM, some test CLIs, etc. directly on Jenkins server, and then you forget to upgrade them until something breaks. Why don't we run them in Docker containers instead with Docker images? So we don't have the dependency on the Jenkins server and we see exactly which versions we're running. And our Jenkins file is also self-contained and doesn't depend on these tools being installed on the Jenkins server that is running the job. And we can easily update the image version or use the latest just by changing the tag in the Jenkins file. Another example, let's say you look at their Terraform workflow and see they are checking in Terraform state file in the Git repository, plus they execute the Terraform apply command directly from their machines. So you go like, guys, this is wrong. May I introduce some best practices of using Terraform that will make our work easier? Aren't you running constantly into issues when someone breaks Terraform state because of local configuration? And they will nod their heads and say, yes, we actually have this problem often, but we learned to be careful to avoid this. And you say, okay, I just need a few hours to fix all this stuff, so it won't even interfere with your workflow. So you do your thing while I optimize our processes. So you go and create a remote Terraform state in S3 bucket, for example. Then you configure Terraform backend with this remote state, and you migrate the local state to the remote S3 bucket with Terraform command. And it's easy for you because you know how to do it. And you go to the team and you teach them as well. So guys, here is the change I've made. So from now on, we won't have a Terraform state file in Git repository. It will be a remote state. So you won't have any Terraform state issues and you don't have to sync and coordinate with each other who is updating and checking in the Terraform state updates at what time. And your team is happy and you had an opportunity to prove from day one that you are an experienced engineer. You feel great because your team just saw you solve their technical issue, so you scored points immediately. And it looked so effortless because you knew how to do it. So now you are not just a new guy or gal who just joined the team. Suddenly you have a status of a problem solver who can even teach others about best practices. Because you not only know how to do stuff, but you also understand why these things are done this way. Imagine how that would feel and how your team will value you. Now you do the second step. You tell your team, okay, let me make this even better. Your team now trusts you because you already proved your competence, so you can do it. So you configure an automated pipeline that first tests and then deploys the Terraform changes to infrastructure automatically. And it's easier to do it now because now you have the remote state instead of the local state. So it actually makes pipeline configuration easier. And you even take advantage of Git workflow to make sure the code changes to infrastructure are reviewed by another engineer before being merged into the main branch, which then triggers the automated deployment with pipeline. So you go to the team and again, you teach them. I made this change because this has following advantages. It makes sure we have one source of truth, which is code in Git, instead of each person just applying changes from their local machine. So we know from Git history who pushed those changes that were deployed. And it also allows us to involve junior engineers in Terraform code changes because they can just push their changes to a feature branch. A senior engineer can do peer review and give feedback for them to learn. Once ready, they can merge and deploy their code changes via pipeline. We can configure pipeline to even deploy same changes to different environments without us having to do any manual work. And you tell your team, by the way, this is a concept called GitOps. Your team is impressed. They say, oh, that's what GitOps is. I heard that word often, but I never really understood what it was. That's amazing. These improvements you made will make our work so much more efficient. We clearly see the benefits that you explained. It's so cool to have you in our team. Where did you learn all this stuff actually? And you say, I learned all this in Nana's DevOps Bootcamp. Because every single detail that I gave as examples is actually covered in our bootcamp, including the implementation and the understanding of why you are doing stuff. So you can even explain it to others. And these are obviously just few examples from the entire bootcamp. This is the level of detail as well as big picture understanding you learn to be able to do exactly what I described here. And I take pride in having created such a learning resource that will make any engineer proud of their engineering skills. And every other engineer in their team completely fascinated and impressed by your knowledge that you get with us. Okay, that was just a little shameless plug here, but the key point of this video is for you to understand not only what tools you need to learn, but at what detail. Now, of course, you will get hired even if you don't know these tools at such a deep level as I described, but maybe at a normal level. And that's because DevOps engineers are so highly demanded that companies will often make compromises even if you aren't super knowledgeable or an expert. But of course, you want to feel super knowledgeable and expert in the field, right? Taking pride in your work feels amazing. In fact, let me tell you a real example. We ourselves often look for DevOps engineers to hire them. So I know how it is from the employer perspective. When we look for DevOps engineers and we only look for senior engineers, very experienced ones to support our bootcamp participants, the core shown here in these job descriptions is exactly what we are looking for. And I can honestly tell you that very few experienced DevOps practitioners know all of this, which is surprising for me because for senior engineers, I expect them to know all these tools and technologies that we cover in our DevOps Bootcamp. So sometimes we need months to find expert DevOps engineers who actually know all the tech in DevOps Bootcamp, let alone our DevSecOps Bootcamp, which is much more advanced. We also list all the tech as required, knowing that many candidates won't actually fulfill all the criteria. And in few cases, even when we hired senior experienced DevOps engineers, we needed to make them go through the DevOps and DevSecOps bootcamps to fill any knowledge gaps they had, even from the actual years of DevOps work experience. So that's what DevOps engineering requirements look like. That's what market is looking for. That's the skill set that you need to build in order to be eligible to interview for such jobs. With that, thank you for sticking till the end, and I'll see you in the next video.